I still remember the first time I saw her, as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It was one of those clear autumn days in North Dakota where the sky stretched forever, a stark, brilliant blue, and the air was crisp enough to remind you that winter wasn't far. She was standing at the farmer's market, a basket of apples cradled in her arms, her chestnut hair catching the sunlight like a halo. She wasn't beautiful in the way magazines define beauty, but there was something about her. Maybe it was the way she tilted her head as she listened to the vendor, or the quiet confidence in her posture, that made the whole world slow down for a moment. Her name was Julia, and saying it still feels like a memory I haven't quite let go of. Back then, I believed in things like fate. I'd been an ambitious kid fresh out of college, taking up a job at the local paper, dreaming of becoming the next great American journalist. She was studying to be a nurse, one of those people who seemed to carry light with them wherever they went. We fit together so naturally it was like we'd known each other for lifetimes. Our early years were a blur of laughter, long drives through endless plains, and whispered promises under the North Dakota stars. We planned everything: a small house with a wraparound porch, 2 kids, maybe 3, if we could handle the chaos, and careers that mattered. I remember how her eyes sparkled when she spoke of traveling to Europe, how she described standing in front of the Eiffel Tower or getting lost in the streets of Venice. For a while, we didn't need much. Our house was tiny, but we filled it with warmth. I worked my way up at the newspaper, eventually running the features section. Julia, with her gentle way of speaking and steady hands, found her place in a local clinic. There were days when we'd come home so exhausted we could barely talk, collapsing on the couch with plates of takeout balanced on our knees. But even those days felt full, like we were building something solid, something that would last. The little things mattered most. Mornings spent tangled in sheets, sunlight filtering through the windows as we talked about nothing. The smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen while she hummed to herself, out of tune but happy. Weekends spent exploring small towns, looking for antique shops and diners that served the best pie. We lived simply, but it was ours. People say love doesn't last, that it's a chemical reaction, fleeting by nature. But I never believed that. Not then. Julia made me believe in permanence, in something steady and untouchable. I built my world around that belief. Around her. I suppose now I see the cracks were always there, even if I ignored them. The way she'd sometimes drift into silence during dinner, her gaze focused on something distant, unreachable. Or how the laughter that once came so easily became forced at times, as if she were wearing a mask I couldn't see through. But back then, I thought I knew her better than anyone. I trusted her the way a child trusts the earth to hold them when they fall. It's strange how we cling to the stories we tell ourselves. How we refuse to see the truth until it's staring us in the face. Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment things began to unravel. It didn't happen all at once. It was like a slow leak, almost invisible at first, until suddenly the ground beneath my feet was soaked and I was sinking into it. But that's getting ahead of myself. Before the doubt, before the pain, there was love. Pure and unshakable. Or so I thought. Sometimes I wish I could go back to those days. Not because I want to relive them, God knows I've spent enough time lost in memory, but because I want to see the signs I missed. To understand where it all went wrong. To catch that moment when the warmth began to slip away, unnoticed. Back then, I was happy. I was a man in love. And nothing else mattered. For now, though, let me take you back to the beginning. The days when everything felt like a promise. Before the silence crept in. Before the questions began to gnaw at me like a splinter buried too deep to reach. Before I became the man you'll come to know. It began with something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that I almost missed it altogether. It was a Saturday, early spring. The snow had finally begun to melt, leaving the yard a patchy mess of brown grass and dirty ice. Julia was at the kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea, staring out the window. I walked in, rubbing sleep from my eyes. "Morning," I said, my voice still gravelly. She turned to look at me, but there was a delay, half a second too long before her smile appeared. A slight thing, A flicker of hesitation. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I knew her. I knew that smile. Something about it felt wrong. "Morning," she replied softly, almost absent-mindedly. It was a nothing moment. Just an odd beat, forgotten almost as soon as it happened. But later I'd remember it. I'd replay it in my mind, over and over, like a scratch on an old record. Of course, I didn't confront it then. I didn't even think about it much. Life moved forward. Days bled into one another, work at the paper, deadlines to meet, Julia's long shifts at the clinic. We were like two gears spinning side by side but rarely catching. It happens in marriages, I told myself. People get busy. But then there was the phone. It was a week later. Julia was in the shower, and her phone, which she'd left on the nightstand, buzzed twice. I wouldn't have noticed if not for the sound. It wasn't the usual soft hum of her notifications. It was different. I glanced at it, instinctively curious, and froze. "See you soon?" The message was from a number I didn't recognize. No name, just a string of digits. I stared at it, waiting for the screen to go dark. My heart thudded harder than it should have, my brain fumbling for reasons, explanations. Maybe it was a co-worker. Maybe it was something for the clinic. I told myself it was nothing. That's what trust is, right? Believing the best until proven otherwise. I put the phone back exactly where it was, like a thief leaving no trace. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The message clung to my mind like a stain. That night, I tried to act normal. We sat on the couch watching some cooking show she liked, her legs curled under her, close enough that I could feel her warmth. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, how she laughed at the contestants, how she sipped her wine. Julia, my Julia. The woman I'd spent 10 years with. It was absurd to think there was anything to worry about. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I started noticing more things after that. Small things. Little changes that might have meant nothing on their own but together began to feel like a pattern. The way she guarded her phone, tucking it under her pillow at night. The late nights at the clinic that seemed to grow more frequent. The new perfume she'd bought, something floral and sharp, so unlike her usual subtle scents. One evening, I found myself watching her as she brushed her hair at the vanity. She caught me staring in the mirror. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Nothing," I said quickly, but my voice came out wrong, strained. She turned to face me then, her brow furrowed. "You've been quiet lately. Is something wrong?" I opened my mouth to say no. To smile and shake it off. But something stopped me. "I don't know," I said finally. "It just feels like we're off. Like we're not as close as we used to be." She looked at me for a long time before replying. "I think we're just tired. Work's been a lot lately. For both of us." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. And yet I didn't believe her. Not really. The seed had been planted. Doubt. It spread quietly at first, like ivy creeping up the side of a house, slow, persistent, unshakable. I told myself I wasn't paranoid, that I wasn't. That guy. The one who snoops through his wife's things or accuses her without reason. But no matter how hard I tried to bury the questions, they grew roots. The tipping point came 2 weeks later. Julia was heading out to grab a late dinner with a colleague. It was her day off, and I'd been looking forward to a quiet evening together. When I asked who she was meeting, she hesitated. Another one of those small, almost imperceptible pauses. "Claire," she said finally. "From the clinic. We've been meaning to catch up." She smiled as she said it, even kissed me goodbye on the cheek. But when the door closed behind her, the house felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out. I sat there for a long time, my heart pounding. Something didn't add up. That night I gave in. It started small. I opened her laptop. I hated myself for it, even as I typed in her password, which I knew without ever needing to ask. For a moment, I hoped I'd find nothing. That she'd prove me wrong, and I could feel like an idiot and move on. But then I saw it. An email. Just one. The subject line read, "Last night." My pulse hammered in my ears as I clicked it open. The message was short. "Still thinking about you. I can't stop." There was no name, only an initial, J. The room spun. My throat felt tight. I slammed the laptop shut and sat back, staring at the wall. J. Who the hell was J? The name didn't matter, I realized. The words did. "Still thinking about you. I can't stop." I didn't sleep that night. Julia came home late, her cheeks flushed, her smile easy. She kissed me goodnight, completely unaware that something inside me had cracked. The next morning, I made a call. His name was Robert. He was a private investigator out of Bismarck, the kind of guy you'd find in a paperback novel, gruff, direct, and discreet. I never thought I'd be the kind of man to hire someone like him, but there I was, pacing the kitchen with his card in my hand, my thumb running over the edges. When he answered, his voice was clipped and professional. "What do you need?" I almost hung up. Almost. But the words came out before I could stop them. "I think my wife is cheating on me." There was silence on the other end, the kind that made me feel exposed, raw. "Okay," Robert said finally. "What do you want me to do?" I hesitated. My gut twisted at the thought of what I was about to say. "Follow her. Get proof. I need to know." He agreed to meet me that afternoon. I hung up and stared at the phone in my hand, hating myself. What kind of man does this? What kind of husband spies on his wife? But the alternative, not knowing, was worse. The next week felt like living in purgatory. Robert kept me updated, sending me short, curt messages. "Clinic late shift. Normal." Or, "Dinner with friends. Uneventful." For a few days I thought I might be losing my mind. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Julia was telling the truth, and I was destroying our marriage with my paranoia. But then, on a Thursday evening, everything changed. I was at my desk at the paper, struggling to focus on edits for an upcoming feature. My phone buzzed. A message from Robert. "She's not at the clinic. Leaving a house south of town. Not registered to her or coworkers. Sending photos." I stared at the words until they blurred together. My fingers felt numb as I unlocked the photos he'd sent. The first one showed Julia's car parked outside a modest two-story house I didn't recognize. The second. My breath caught. It was Julia. Standing on the front porch. Smiling at a man I'd never seen before, a tall figure, his hand brushing her arm, too familiar. The image was grainy but clear enough to make my stomach drop. I felt sick. I pushed back from my desk, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I had to get out, had to move. I couldn't breathe. Outside, the cold North Dakota air hit me like a slap, but it didn't help. My hands trembled as I gripped my phone, staring at that photo again and again. It was real. She was lying to me. When Julia came home that night, I watched her carefully. She walked in like nothing had happened, her coat draped over her arm, humming softly to herself. "Hey," she said, smiling. "You're up late." "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. She came over to kiss me, and I let her, hating the part of me that still wanted to believe she was mine. That we were okay. But we weren't. I knew now. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. I couldn't confront her right away. The photos burned a hole in my pocket, but something stopped me every time I looked at her. Maybe it was the fear of what she'd say, the confirmation that would shatter the thin hope I still clung to. Maybe it was the memories, the years we'd spent building a life together. So I waited. For 2 days I carried the truth with me like a stone in my chest. I barely slept, barely ate. Julia noticed, of course. "You've been distant," she said one night as we lay in bed. Her hand reached for mine under the sheets, her touch tentative. "Is something wrong?" I stared at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me. "I don't know." "You tell me." There was a pause. What's that supposed to mean? I turned to look at her then, the woman I'd loved for so long, her face soft and familiar in the dim light. Where were you on Thursday night? Her brow furrowed. I told you. At the clinic. We were short-staffed. Don't lie to me. My voice came out sharper than I intended, and she flinched. Why are you saying this? Her voice wavered, but there was something else there too, defensiveness, maybe even fear. What's going on with you? I sat up, throwing the blanket off. My hands shook as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. This is what's going on. I swiped to the photo and held it out to her. Who is he, Julia? Her face went pale. For a long moment she just stared at the screen, her lips slightly parted as if she couldn't find the words. Finally, she looked up at me. Where did you get that? That's not an answer. My voice broke, anger and desperation crashing together. Who is he? How long has this been going on? She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. It's not what you think. Don't, I said bitterly, shaking my head. Don't insult me with that. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked away, her voice small. His name is James. James. The name landed like a punch to the gut. A stranger yet suddenly so real. How long? I asked, my voice hoarse. A few months. The air left my lungs. A few months. While I'd been here, loving her, trusting her, she'd been, what? Meeting him? Lying to my face? The betrayal hit me in waves, each one harder than the last. Why? The word came out like a whisper. Julia's eyes met mine then, and for the first time, I saw something I didn't expect, pain. I don't know, she said softly. I can't explain it. I didn't mean for this to happen. That's not good enough. I snapped. You don't just wake up one day and decide to. I felt empty. Her voice broke, and a tear slipped down her cheek. I don't know when it started, but I felt like I was drowning. And you were so busy with work, with your deadlines. I tried to talk to you, but you never noticed. Her words cut deep, sharper than any blade. I wanted to argue, to scream that it wasn't true, that I'd always been there. But had I? I thought back to the nights I'd stayed late at the paper, the weekends I spent buried in drafts instead of with her. Had I missed the signs? That doesn't excuse what you did, I said finally, my voice shaking. You should have told me. You owed me that much. She nodded, wiping her face. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But sorry wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The days that followed were unbearable. We moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding each other's eyes, our words clipped and hollow. I couldn't look at her without seeing him, without hearing her confession replay in my mind. At night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling while Julia cried quietly beside me. Part of me hated her for what she'd done. Another part hated myself, for not being enough, for letting this happen. I considered leaving more than once. Packing a bag, walking out the door, and never looking back. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I found myself doing something even worse. I searched for James. I needed to see him, to put a face to the name that haunted me. It didn't take long. Robert sent me his address, along with a brief file. James Miller, 42 years old. Divorced. No kids. Owns a small construction company south of town. I drove there one afternoon, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. His house was the same one from the photo, a modest two-story with a white porch. I sat across the street, my heart pounding, waiting for something I couldn't define. And then he came outside. James. He was taller than me, broader too, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had seen its share of hard days. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if nothing in the world could touch him. And for some reason that made me furious. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands ached. I wanted to get out of the car, to walk up to him and demand answers. What did she see in you? What did you give her that I couldn't? But I stayed where I was, watching him disappear back into the house. As I drove home, shame washed over me. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, a man spying on strangers, obsessed with the truth I already knew. When I got home, Julia was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched dinner. She looked up as I walked in, her face pale and drawn. "Where were you?" she asked softly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I walked past her, into our room, and closed the door behind me. I stayed in the guest room that night. It was a small, cold space we'd always reserved for visitors, never for us. The sheets felt foreign, stiff and unfamiliar, a reminder of how far we'd drifted. Julia didn't come to find me. I wasn't sure if I wanted her to. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, it felt like any other day, but as soon as I opened my eyes, reality came crashing back. The betrayal. The emptiness. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor until the coffee went cold. When I finally emerged, Julia was sitting at the kitchen table. She looked up, her eyes tired and red-rimmed. "Morning," she said softly, her voice tentative. I didn't respond. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the silence between us so heavy it felt like the walls might cave in. Finally, she spoke again. "Are you going to leave?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unanswerable. Was I going to leave? The thought had kept me awake for days, swirling in my head like a storm I couldn't escape. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her I was done, that I couldn't look at her without seeing him. But the truth was messier. "I don't know," I said finally. My voice sounded hollow. "I don't know what I'm going to do." She nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Stop saying that," I snapped, the words cutting sharper than I intended. "It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change what you did." Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. Or at least I told myself I didn't. I left the house that day. I couldn't stand being there, surrounded by the ghosts of our life together. I drove aimlessly through the open plains of North Dakota, where the fields stretched endlessly, offering no answers. The sky was vast and gray, as if mourning with me. I ended up at a small diner off the highway, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. I sat at the counter and ordered coffee I didn't want. Around me, people talked and laughed, their lives simple and untouched by the kind of hurt I carried. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, set the mug down in front of me. "Rough day?" she asked, as if she could see straight through me. I almost laughed. "Something like that." She nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "Sometimes life throws things at you don't think you can handle. But you do. You find a way." Her words stayed with me long after I left the diner. Did people really find a way to get through this? Did marriages survive betrayals like this? I didn't know. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. When I got home, the house was quiet. Julia was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through an old photo album. She looked up when I walked in. "Do you remember this?" I hesitated in the doorway. "What?" She turned the album toward me. It was a photo of us from years ago, standing in front of our first apartment, grinning like idiots, my arms slung around her shoulders. We looked so young, so sure of ourselves. "We were happy then," she said softly. I swallowed hard. "Yeah. We were." She closed the album and looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand something. I never stopped loving you." Her words cut deep. I wanted to believe her, but how could I? "You don't hurt the people you love," I said, my voice trembling. "I was hurting too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore." The words stung, but they also hit something I hadn't been ready to face, my own guilt. I thought back to all the nights I'd stayed late at work, to the way I'd taken her for granted, assuming she'd always be there. Had I pushed her away without realizing it? But no. I couldn't let myself go there. Her choices were her own, no matter what I had done. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, the words heavy. "I don't know if I want to." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand." We sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. I thought about leaving. I thought about staying. Neither option felt right. Both felt like defeat. But one thing was clear: I couldn't live like this. Not anymore. The next morning, I packed a bag. Julia watched me from the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Where are you going?" she asked quietly. "I need time," I said. "Time to think. Time to figure out what I want." She didn't argue. She just nodded. "Take as long as you need." As I walked out the door, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. The life we'd built, the dreams we'd shared, they all felt like ashes now, scattered by a wind I couldn't control. But as I got into my car and drove away, I realized something else. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from the truth. I was facing it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards something new. I didn't go far. A small motel on the outskirts of town became my refuge, its neon vacancy sign flickering outside the window like a heartbeat I couldn't silence. The room was sparse, a bed that creaked, a scratched wooden desk, and a TV that played nothing but static most of the time. It was perfect. Empty spaces matched how I felt. I spent the first day doing nothing but staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic. Time passed differently in that room, minutes blending into hours until I wasn't sure if it was morning or night. When I finally turned on my phone, there was one message from Julia. "I hope you're okay. I'm here if you want to talk." I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could hear her voice in the words, soft and uncertain. I almost replied, but I stopped myself. What would I say? That I wasn't okay? That I missed her even though I hated her for what she'd done? Instead, I shut the phone off again and buried it at the bottom of my bag. The next day, I went for a drive. North Dakota's plains stretched endlessly in every direction, vast and unbroken. I'd always loved this landscape, the quiet majesty of it. But now, it just reminded me of emptiness, of how small I felt within it. I found myself at a lake we used to visit during our first years together. It was a wide, glassy surface, reflecting the gray clouds overhead. Julia had loved this place. She'd always said it was the only place where she could truly clear her mind. I stood at the edge of the water, the wind biting my face, and thought about her. About us. Had there ever been a moment where we'd been truly happy? Or had we just been telling ourselves a story, clinging to the idea of love long after it had started to fray? That night, I made a mistake. I went back to the photos Robert had sent me. I hadn't deleted them. I couldn't. I stared at the grainy image of Julia and James on the porch, his hand on her arm, her smile, soft, intimate, a smile I hadn't seen in years. I wanted to stop looking, but I couldn't. It was like picking at a wound that wouldn't heal, reopening it just to feel something. Anything. The anger returned, boiling up inside me until I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my jacket and walked out into the cold night, my breath steaming in the air. I didn't know where I was going until I got there. His house. James's house. I parked across the street again, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. His lights were on, the faint glow spilling out of the windows. I imagined him inside, comfortable, content, while I sat there, unraveling. I wanted to go up to the door, to pound on it until he came out and demand answers. Why her? Why now? But I didn't. Instead, I sat there for hours, watching his house like some kind of madman. By the time I drove away, the anger had burned itself out, leaving only shame behind. What was I doing? This wasn't me. This wasn't the man I wanted to be. The next morning, I sat at the small motel desk and wrote Julia a letter. I didn't plan to send it, but I needed to get the words out. Julia. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. I don't know if I can forgive myself either. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being the people we promised we'd be. Maybe it's both our faults. Maybe it doesn't matter. I loved you. I still do, even though it hurts to admit it. But love isn't supposed to feel like this, like a weight you can't put down. I don't know what happens next. I just know I can't keep living in the past. I hope you find what you're looking for. I hope I do too. David. I folded the letter and tucked it into my bag. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step forward. That afternoon, I drove back into town. My editor had been understanding about my absence, but I knew I couldn't stay away forever. I needed normalcy, something to anchor me. When I walked into the paper's office, the noise and bustle felt almost soothing. I spent the next few hours buried in work, focusing on deadlines and edits until my mind felt quiet for the first time in days. It wasn't until I was packing up to leave that I noticed her. Julia. She was standing across the street, watching me through the window. Our eyes met, and she raised her hand, almost hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure I'd acknowledge her. I didn't know what to do. For a moment I just stared at her, my chest tight. Then I turned away and walked out the back door. I avoided Julia after that. It wasn't hard. North Dakota was vast, and people kept to themselves here. I filled my days with work, buried myself in edits, drafts, and headlines until the noise in my head dulled to a quiet hum. For a while it worked. The office became my escape, my cocoon. But nights were different. Nights were when the silence crept in, and all the questions came flooding back. Was she thinking about him? Had she missed me, even once? Or was I just a loose end she didn't know how to tie off? I'd drive around town aimlessly, past places that used to mean something, our favorite diner, the park where we'd spent lazy Sundays, the small bakery where we'd bought the cake for our first anniversary. Now they felt like landmarks of a life I didn't recognize anymore. One night, I found myself parked outside our house. My house, I corrected myself. Julia was still living there, but it didn't feel like home to me anymore. The curtains in the living room were open, and I could see her sitting on the couch, curled up with a blanket. The light from the TV flickered across her face, and for a second, I forgot everything. I forgot the betrayal, the lies, the nights spent unraveling. All I saw was the woman I loved. The woman I'd built my life around. I hated her. I loved her. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, torn between wanting to walk through the front door and never wanting to see her again. In the end, I drove away. The next morning, I woke to an unexpected email from Robert, the private investigator. I hadn't heard from him since I told him his services were no longer needed. "Thought you might want to see this," the email read. Attached was a photo. I opened it, my heart pounding. It was Julia and James. But this time, they weren't at his house. They were sitting at a cafe in Bismarck, facing each other, their heads close, talking. They didn't look like lovers. They looked serious. Tense, even. Something about the photo felt off. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. Why would she still be meeting him? Why did it look so different this time? Against my better judgment, I called Robert. "What's this about?" I asked as soon as he picked up. "That's what I wanted to ask you," he replied. "Your wife's been meeting him regularly, but not in the way you might think. She's not sneaking around. They're talking about something." "What?" My voice was sharp. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't think this guy is just some affair. I think there's more to it." More to it. The words rattled around in my head like marbles in a jar. I hung up and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I went home. Julia was in the kitchen when I walked through the door, and for a moment, she looked stunned, as if she'd seen a ghost. "David," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" "I need answers," I said. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt. "No more lies, Julia. No more excuses. Tell me the truth. She set down the dish she was washing and turned to face me. The truth? Yes. Her eyes searched mine, as if deciding whether she could trust me. Finally, she took a deep breath. James isn't what you think. It's complicated. Make it simple. I shot back. You owe me that. She sighed and sank into a chair, running her fingers through her hair. I didn't tell you everything because I didn't know how. Because I was scared you wouldn't understand. Understand what? She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something raw in her eyes, fear. Regret. James is my brother, she said. The room seemed to tilt. I blinked at her, certain I hadn't heard correctly. What? She swallowed hard. My half-brother. I didn't know about him until a few months ago. My mother had an affair years ago, before she married my dad. She never told anyone, not even me. James found me after she passed. I sank into the chair across from her, my mind spinning. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know how, she said, her voice breaking. It was so much to process, and I was scared. Scared of what it meant, scared of what you'd think. And then I messed up. I let things fall apart between us. I'm not proud of it, David. I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Julia had been lying, yes, but not about what I thought. It wasn't another man. It wasn't an affair. It was family. A hidden part of her life she'd been too afraid to share. For the first time in weeks, the anger inside me faltered. That night, I lay awake in my old bed, staring at the ceiling. Julia had told me everything, and it changed things. But it didn't erase the pain. The distance between us still felt vast, like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. I didn't know if we could fix what had broken. I didn't know if I wanted to try. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than anger, something like clarity. The truth wasn't what I expected. It never is. The truth sat between us like a fragile thing. Even after Julia's confession, the air in the house was thick, heavy with unspoken words. I spent the following days moving through the rooms I once called home, each corner a monument to the life we built. A life I wasn't sure I could return to. Julia gave me space. She didn't push or beg, though I could see the questions in her eyes every time we passed each other. I wondered if she hoped that telling me the truth would fix everything. It didn't. Knowing James was her brother didn't erase the months of doubt, the erosion of trust, or the nights I'd spent tearing myself apart. The photo, the one of them on the porch, still haunted me. It wasn't their relationship that unsettled me anymore. It was me, the man I'd become in my desperation to uncover a lie that didn't exist. The one who'd hired a private investigator, who'd sat outside another man's house like a stalker. I hated that version of myself as much as I hated the cracks I hadn't noticed in our marriage. And so I drifted. I spent a lot of time at the paper, working late until the building was dark and the streets outside were empty. My editor, Tom, tried to be subtle when he asked about Julia. Small talk about life at home turned into awkward pauses when I didn't respond. You know, he said one evening as I leaned against his desk, staring blankly at a layout draft. You look like a guy carrying around a stone you don't need anymore. I frowned. What? He set his pen down and looked at me over his glasses. Whatever it is eating at you, let it go, David. Before it eats you whole. I didn't respond, but his words followed me home. That night, Julia knocked softly on the door to the guest room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, flipping through an old notebook, half full of forgotten article ideas. David? Her voice was tentative. Can I come in? Yeah, I muttered. She opened the door and stepped inside, holding a mug of tea in her hands. You're working late again, she said softly. I thought you might want this. I stared at her for a moment before taking the mug, the warmth of it unexpected against my cold hands. Thanks. She hesitated, lingering near the door. Do you hate me? The question caught me off guard. I looked up at her, my chest tightening. No, I said finally. I don't hate you, Julia. Then why does it feel like you're punishing me? Her voice cracked on the last word, and it hit me like a gut punch. I didn't know how to respond. Maybe I was punishing her. Maybe I was punishing myself. She sat down in the chair across from me, her hands clasped in her lap. I know I messed up. Not by finding James, but by hiding it from you. I was scared. Scared of what he meant, scared of losing you. And then, everything spiraled. I'm not saying it's your fault, but we were broken, David. You have to see that. I swallowed hard. Why didn't you come to me? I did, she whispered. In 100 little ways. You just didn't see it. Her words stung because they were true. How many times had I been too busy to notice her sadness? How many dinners had been eaten in silence because I was distracted by work? How many nights had we laid next to each other like strangers? We both sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on us. I don't know how to fix this, I admitted. Her eyes filled with tears. Neither do I. But I want to try. The silence stretched between us, fragile and uncertain. I didn't know if trying was enough. The next morning, I left the house before dawn. I drove aimlessly again, ending up back at the lake. The water was still, the early light breaking across its surface like shards of glass. I sat on the hood of my car, breathing in the cold air, thinking about everything Julia had said. Had I failed her? Had she failed me? Or had we both just let each other slip away, too afraid to grab hold of what was left? I didn't have an answer. But as I sat there, I realized something. I'd spent weeks, months, trapped in the past, obsessing over what was broken instead of asking myself what came next. Whether or not Julia and I could find our way back to each other, I needed to move forward. I needed to let go of the anger, the resentment, the hurt that had consumed me. I needed to forgive her, not for her sake, but for mine. When I got home, Julia was sitting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up as I walked toward her, her expression cautious. Can we talk? I said. She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. I sat down beside her, the two of us staring out at the empty street. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then I turned to her. I don't know what happens next, I said quietly. But I don't want to keep living like this. I don't want to hate you, Julia. She looked at me, her eyes shimmering. I don't want that either. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. I think I need time. We both do. To figure out who we are. What we want. She nodded slowly. I understand. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift inside me, a small release, like a knot loosening. I didn't know if we'd ever fix what had broken, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. And that was enough. Time moved differently after that day. The house felt quieter, the silence no longer suffocating but more like the hush that comes after a storm. Julia and I fell into a strange rhythm, polite, careful, like two people tiptoeing across thin ice. I slept in the guest room, but some nights, I'd hear her crying softly in our bedroom. I didn't go to her. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know if I could comfort her. Not yet. Days turned into weeks. I went back to work full-time, throwing myself into projects that demanded my attention. For the first time in years, I stopped asking for extra shifts, stopped hiding behind my deadlines. My editor noticed. You seem different, Tom said one afternoon, eyeing me across his desk. Good different? I asked. He shrugged. You look like a man who's deciding what he wants. It stuck with me. I wasn't sure what I wanted, not really. But I was trying to figure it out, one day at a time. Julia and I started talking again, really talking. It was awkward at first, like relearning the steps to an old dance. We didn't talk about James, or the hurt that lingered between us. Not yet. Instead, we talked about small things, her work at the clinic, my latest story at the paper, the way the leaves were finally turning green again. One evening, we sat on the porch together, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. Do you ever think about when we first met? she asked softly, her gaze fixed on the fading light. Sometimes, I admitted. She smiled faintly. I miss that version of us. The way we were back then. Me too. We sat in silence for a long time, the words hanging between us like an unfinished sentence. I wanted to tell her I still loved her, that a part of me always would. But love wasn't enough, not anymore. 2 weeks later, I packed my bags. It wasn't an impulsive decision, but it still felt heavy. Julia was in the kitchen when I carried my suitcase down the stairs. She turned to look at me, her face pale but composed. "You're leaving," she said quietly. "I need to," I replied, the words steady but painful. "For both of us." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Is this goodbye?" I hesitated, looking at her, this woman who had been my everything for so long. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe it's just goodbye for now." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. "I want you to be happy, David. Even if it's not with me." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I want the same for you." We stood there for a moment, caught in the weight of everything we couldn't say. Then she stepped forward and hugged me, her arms wrapping around me like they used to, familiar and warm. For a moment, I let myself hold her back. When I pulled away, I kissed her forehead gently. "Take care of yourself, Julia. You too." I walked out the door and didn't look back. I rented a small apartment in Bismarck, nothing fancy, just a place to start over. The first few days were strange. I'd reach for the other side of the bed in the middle of the night, expecting to find her there. I'd see something in the store, a bottle of her favorite wine, a scarf she might like, and for a split second I'd forget we weren't together anymore. But it got easier. Slowly. I started spending more time with friends, saying yes to things I'd turned down for years. I played pickup basketball on weekends, drank coffee at a cafe downtown instead of alone in my kitchen. I wrote more, not just for work, but for myself. One evening, I found myself back at the lake, the water smooth and still as the sky darkened. I thought about Julia, not with anger or regret, but with something closer to acceptance. We'd loved each other once. That was real. And maybe we'd broken each other along the way, but we'd also built something beautiful while it lasted. I let the memory settle, like a stone dropped into the water, and watched the ripples fade. A few weeks later, Julia sent me a letter. "David, I've been thinking a lot about us. About everything we lost and everything we had. I don't know if we'll ever see each other again, but I want you to know that I'm grateful for the years we shared. You were the love of my life, even when we couldn't hold on to each other. I hope you're finding peace. I hope you're happy. Julia." I folded the letter and set it on my desk. For a long time, I just stared at it, my heart full of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe I would see her again one day. Maybe not. But for the first time, that didn't scare me. Life would keep moving forward. So would I. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of the lake again. The seasons had shifted, and autumn had returned to North Dakota, painting the trees in shades of gold and red. The water reflected the sky, calm, endless, unbroken. I'd made peace with the silence by then. I no longer needed to fill it with questions or answers that wouldn't come. I'd stopped looking for blame, stopped wondering who was at fault, or if the cracks in our marriage had been inevitable. Some truths don't come with closure. You learn to live with the missing pieces. In those 6 months, I'd rebuilt myself, piece by piece. The apartment in Bismarck had begun to feel like home. I'd taken up running in the mornings, my feet pounding against the pavement, carrying me farther each day. I made new friends, real ones, who didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I even wrote a column that people noticed. The editor called it my best work yet. Something about the honesty in my words. There were nights when I still thought about Julia, but the pain had softened. I remembered the good things, the mornings wrapped in blankets, the sound of her laughter, the way she used to hold my hand in crowded places. I let those memories exist without bitterness. Julia's letter sat on my desk at home, tucked beneath a stack of books, I hadn't replied, and I wasn't sure I ever would. Some stories don't need an epilogue. One afternoon, as I sat at the cafe downtown with a notebook and a cup of coffee, I looked up and noticed a woman sitting alone by the window. She was reading a book, her brow furrowed in concentration, a faint smile playing on her lips. Something about her reminded me of the way I used to look at Julia, the way you look at someone when you still believe in possibilities. She caught me looking and smiled politely before turning back to her book. I smiled too, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel forced. A week later, I ran into Tom outside the paper. He grinned as he clapped me on the shoulder. "You look good," he said. "Lighter somehow." "I feel good," I replied, surprised by how true it was. He nodded. "See? I told you, you just had to let it go." Letting go. It sounded so simple, but it had taken everything I had to get here. To stop clutching at the past, to stop replaying the mistakes over and over again. The anger, the guilt, the regret, I'd carried them like stones for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk without them. Now they were gone. Or maybe not gone, but lighter. Easier to bear. I visited the lake one last time before winter came. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that bites at your skin and makes you feel alive. I stood at the water's edge, my hands in my pockets, and watched the clouds drift slowly across the sky. For a long time, I'd thought healing meant erasing the past, replacing the pain with something new. But I'd learned that wasn't true. The past doesn't disappear. It becomes part of you, woven into the person you are now. Julia had been a part of my story, but she wasn't the whole story. Neither was the hurt she'd caused, or the mistakes I'd made. There was more ahead of me, more love, more loss, more moments that would shape me. I closed my eyes, breathing in the cold, clean air. I was ready. Ready to forgive, not just Julia, but myself. Ready to move forward, into whatever came next. And as I turned to walk back to my car, I realized something else. The silence, the one I'd feared for so long, hadn't stolen anything from me. It had given me space to listen. To myself. To the world around me. To the quiet voice inside that said, "You're going to be okay." For the first time in a long time, I believed it.